Hello everyone, and welcome to the Year 7 Round 2 QDU Academy session. This session will be addressing the topic that Australia should become a republic. In terms of an overview, what we'll be going through in this session is firstly a brief reflection on Round 1, secondly, a couple points on considering the context of this debate and why this was set as a topic. Then I will provide a little bit of guidance on what sort of setup you might want to start thinking of for this topic, and then a couple points on brainstorming points and what sorts of clashes or issues or themes you might be thinking around, and lastly, a slide on structuring points, providing a slightly alternative and more strategic structure beyond just the peel and Oreo structures that some teams may be using. So, in terms of reflection, firstly, I think this is a great opportunity to have a little bit of thinking about what you did well on the previous round. I think everyone gave excellent quality speeches, quite likely, so have a think about what you did well and what you want to carry on into the next round and future rounds as well. So, did you try rebuttal? Did you have well researched arguments? Did you speak to time? And did you have sufficient eye contact? Then, after we have a think about what we've done well on, we obviously have to think about what you can improve on. So, did the adjudicator give you any feedback? Did your coach make any suggestions? Is there anything you think you could improve upon? Whether that be in terms of the case or rebuttal, obviously, as we're moving into a new round with a fresh topic, this is an excellent opportunity to implement all of that excellent feedback that you have likely received. So, now let's discuss the context. Whether or not Australia should become a republic has been a highly topical topic for many, many years. This discussion has flared up again quite recently with the death of Queen Elizabeth, and it has been met with new opinions and new perspectives as well. As you can see from all of these news headlines, there are various different perspectives on this topic, ranging from very strongly agreeing that Australia should become a republic to people that are very staunchly believing and standing by our constitutional monarchy system that is currently in place. So, as you can see from all of these news headlines, obviously this is a very well discussed and heavily discussed topic, so I'd highly encourage you to do lots of research, even if that is not research for specific statistics or specific pieces of evidence. Having a wide variety of opinions, and especially opinions from people that perhaps, or opinions from groups that perhaps you do not belong to, can be very, very useful, as they all bring different things to the table, and they are all belonging to stakeholders that all deserve to be considered. So, in terms of the context, the main questions that we want to be thinking around is why was this set as a topic? All of the topics that you will come across in the competition from the competition are all going to be have set as a topic because it relates to some sort of issue in real life, most likely a societal issue, but also possibly a political or an economic or an ethical issue. So having a think about why this was set as a topic can kind of naturally lead you to the affirmative and negative arguments that should be expected for this topic. So then after you have a think about that, have a think about what the problem is. Thinking about the problem, so basically the main societal issue that this topic is set to address, in a very detailed way can be very useful for setting up the rest of your case. So have a think around these questions. What is the cause of the problem? What are the effects of the problem and whom does that affect? And also, what is the scale of the problem? Having a think about that last question, a more severe problem will justify a more drastic solution, but also note that a more severe problem is going to be harder to solve. What this means is that if you are on the affirmative team and you choose to set up the problem as being very, very, very disadvantageous and as being incredibly harmful and incredibly severe, that might make it quite easy to justify a large and significant legislative change like making Australia a republic. However, it is also important to note what strategic pitfalls may come with that decision, making the problem a lot more Severe is also going to make it harder to solve, which means you will have to do more work within your points to prove that your model, making Australia a republic, will solve this entire, or at least the majority of this problem. Have a think about how this will affect the strategy of your team, and also make sure to discuss and agree with all of your teammates on what sort of stance your team will put forward altogether. In terms of general knowledge, just to clarify, a republic is a system where the head of state is elected, and a constitutional monarchy, which is what Australia currently is, and which is the main alternative to a republic, is where the head of state is the monarch. So this means that the head of state is inherited, it's an inherited position instead of being a position that someone is elected to. Now, I think it's really important to have a think about where Australia gets its king or queen from. Obviously, we do not have an Australian monarch. However, we do have the English monarchy, and this is quite similar to a lot of countries that belong to the Commonwealth. If you are not quite sure of your knowledge within this area, having a little bit of research here can be really excellent, as there are a lot of online sources available. So, now let's talk about setup. In terms of approaching setup, the first question you should be asking yourself is, what type of debate is this debate? So have a think about whether this is a policy debate or an empirical debate. For policy and empirical debates, both of them require different sorts of setup. A policy debate will require your usual definitions and also a model and possibly a countermodel if you are on the negative team. On the other hand, for an empirical debate, we still have the same definitions. However, we do not have a model or a countermodel anymore. Instead, we have a set of criteria. As we can see from the fact that this is a should topic where we are making an actual change in the world, this means that this is a policy debate. Have a think then about what sort of setup this requires from the affirmative team and the negative team. Is this going to differ? If you are on the negative team, what do you think you will likely expect from the affirmative team, and how can you prepare for the different sorts of things they may possibly include in their model? So now let's take a little bit of a look at definitions. First thing you should be doing when you get a topic is highlighting what the key words in the topic are, and then trying to form definitions for them. At an initial glance, the main words that we can identify as the keywords in the topic are likely going to be Australia and also Republic. Have a think about what these mean. You do not need to include dictionary definitions, but you just need to clarify what they mean for the average person and what give the information that is most relevant for your case and the rest of the debate. If there are any other words that you believe should be defined, please feel free to go ahead as well. So now let's talk a little bit about models and countermodels. For anyone that doesn't know, a model is what the affirmative team must produce in setup for a policy debate, and it is essentially a more detailed plan for how they are going to implement the policy change that the topic describes. So, a couple of the questions that you may want to ask yourself if you are speaking on the affirmative team for this topic is, have a think about what a republic is, what are the essential differences between a republic and a constitutional monarchy that mean our lifestyles will change, when should this change occur, and also what are the key differences with the status quo. Take a look at some examples of constitutional monarchies and republics and see what is going to happen and what the main changes occurring in Australia would be. If you are on the negative team, you may choose to include a countermodel, or you can also elect to argue for the status quo as the best option. If you choose to include a countermodel, that means you are acknowledging that there is some sort of problem, whether that be a small problem or a large problem in the status quo. If you are suggesting a countermodel, that also means that you believe that there is an alternative way to solve this problem that is not the model, that is preferable to the model. So the countermodel is better at solving everything within the status quo than the affirmative team's model is going to be. This means that it is very important for you to have a think about how the status quo works and how you want to choose to characterize the status quo and the problems that may exist within the status quo. If you do not elect to have a countermodel, the main thing that you will be defending is the status quo. Note that even if you have a countermodel, if you are on the negative team, it is still highly advisable to argue for the status quo, and argue that the model will wreak havoc on the status quo. So even if you have a countermodel on the negative team, you cannot rely on it to solve everything. To some degree, you should be defending the status quo. So then it is very, very important that you have an idea of what the status quo looks like. Even if you acknowledge that perhaps some problems exist, why do you think the status quo is super great? What are all of the benefits of the status quo? Have a think about that. So now let's discuss some points. When we are thinking of points, there are a couple of questions you can ask yourself to try and think of more points. Aside from the ones we've looked at already, like asking yourself, why was this set as a topic? And asking yourself, what problems exist in the status quo that could possibly be solved? The other things are generally thinking about the main advantages, disadvantages of being a republic versus being a constitutional monarchy. Also, having a think about if you woke up tomorrow in this world, what would change? I think that second question is a really excellent way to tap into material that perhaps might otherwise be neglected, such as material regarding daily life, and that affects the average person and what would inherently feel a little bit different. So, here are a couple of themes or issues or clashes to think around. Firstly, historical. Have a think about what the historical context of Australia becoming a constitutional monarchy was. Was this a particularly good history? Was this a very peaceful sort of transition or establishment? Or were there conflicts here? And were there any stakeholders that were negatively affected by Australia becoming a constitutional monarchy? Also, have a think about whether society has changed since Australia became a constitutional monarchy. Is Australia the same as it was in Federation? Had there been any significant changes in terms of our ideologies, the different political needs of our people, or even the population makeup of Australia? Then, another thing that we may want to think of is political. So, would this change have any effect on Australia's internal politics? Would the way that different people are treated change at all? Would this cause any change in our rights or any change in terms of the representation that we get politically on a state or a federal level? Would there be any more people involved in politics? How would this change? Also have a think about Australia's external politics or just its international diplomacy as well. Would Australia's relations with different countries change? I think this is particularly important in the context of not only thinking about our relations with Great Britain, but also with the rest of the Commonwealth as well. Are there any particular privileges that we enjoy due to being in the Commonwealth? Or are there any benefits that we might perhaps claim if we leave the Commonwealth and instead join other sorts of associations of countries? Lastly, have a think about patriotism. Would this change Australia's national identity? What is Australia's national identity? Has Australia's national identity changed since it was a constitutional monarchy? Would these sorts of changes that becoming a republic gain, would these be good changes or would these be bad changes? How would these changes affect different people in different ways? After you've thought about all of those points, if you are still struggling for points, an excellent way to brainstorm a greater variety of points can be to think of stakeholders. Stakeholders are also very important in terms of impacting. Impacting, for anyone who doesn't know, is where you explain why a particular point is particularly important and why the adjudicator should choose to prioritize that point above all others when they are making their decision. So, when we're thinking of stakeholders, what we are thinking of is groups of people that are affected by this debate. Have a think about this and make sure to think broadly as well. There are lots of different groups of people that are going to be affected by this debate, so have a think about all of those different people and how they are going to be affected in different ways. Once you have brainstormed a list of stakeholders, then we want to start narrowing that list down a little bit. So have a think about who do you care about the most? Why do you care about this stakeholder the most? Do you think this stakeholder who we might refer to as the vulnerable stakeholder. Will this stakeholder be the same for both the affirmative team and the negative team, or will they be trying to win the debate on the grounds of caring about different people? How will this change your strategy for the debate, and how will this change what sorts of points you are going to prioritize in the debate? The last thing I'd like to mention is that it can be very useful to section off large stakeholders. For example, a key stakeholder in this debate is going to be the population of Australia. However, obviously the population of Australia is very, very large, and there are very, very different people within the entire population of Australia that will likely be affected in different ways. So think about the different groups that we can identify within here. For example, have a think about how Indigenous Australians might be affected by this policy in comparison to Anglo-Saxon Australians, or even immigrants and expats. How might these people be affected in different ways? Will this be good or will this be bad? And most importantly, who do we care the most about? Last point is on structuring points. So this is an alternative structure that we are providing that perhaps might be a little bit more strategic when you are arguing practical material than just pure structure or just putting everything together in a slightly jumbled paragraph. So this is our PMOI structure. We start off with our point label. So this is where you describe the impact you are trying to prove, so whatever benefit or disadvantage you incur in the world. Then we want a description of the problem. What is the problem that exists in the world that you are trying to solve? Then you want to go through the mechanism. What is the way that you make this change? What is the change that this policy is making in the world that is going to cause everything else? Then we want to go through the outcome. So what is the outcome? Is this good or is this bad? Be very descriptive and explain why this is good or why this is bad and who it affects and to what extent it will affect them. Lots and lots of detail here. Last thing we want is some impacting. So why is this outcome particularly important? Does this affect a particularly vulnerable group of people? Does this affect a lot of people? Is this a particularly significant benefit or harm? Why should the adjudicator prioritize this argument above all others when they are making their decision? Last thing I would like to address is that obviously you are watching this on the QDU YouTube channel. We have lots of other helpful videos on our channel, such as a couple of example debates, as well as some videos detailing different issues within the debating, for example, on practical points or on policy and criteria debates. I would highly encourage you to take a look at a couple of those if there are any issues you are struggling with. Thank you very much for watching this session. I wish you the best of luck for the next round of the QDU competition.